Welcome to another episode of the Listen and Learn series. In this video, we're going to specifically discuss education. In the last video, we discussed redlining. And in the redlining video, you may remember I talked about the fact that geographic boundaries were set around neighborhoods. And if you realize the fact that those geographic boundaries impacts the value of your home, that then impacts the value of tax dollars and the taxes that are paid on your home. And that then in turn may impact the value of the public school education system. So I want to make that connection there with redlining. I also want to make the connection to the video about the Black Code, slave codes, and the Jim Crow laws. If you specifically remember in the video about slave codes, you were informed that slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. And that in its essence is the foundation of education, the reading and the writing component. Well, in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about different components that relate specifically to education. I want you to think about some questions before we dive right in. Questions such as, should education be made available to everyone? And if so, is that only a K through 12 education, or should that extend to higher education? And do we believe that there is value in education, and what exactly might that look like? And then finally, what are some of the barriers that may be in place to preventing someone from achieving their fullest potential via an education? So when talking about education, we have to start with the historic 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. And so in that case, essentially, we were in the era of Jim Crow where separate but equal was a thing. And so the idea was Brown versus Board of Education said in a school setting even, separate but equal is not acceptable. So that was a 1954 win, seemingly a win. So there are historic things that happened post the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, such as Ruby Bridges. Many people know that famous picture of Ruby Bridges, the little girl being escorted to school in New Orleans to desegregate the school. She literally had to have a police escort into the school. That was 1960. Or you may have heard of the Little Rock Nine. That was in 1957 when you had these 9 students who were going to desegregate a school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor basically said that he would, despite this case, 1957, we're talking 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, the then Arkansas governor said, we will call the National Guard in if that's what it takes to prevent these students from entering. The day that the students entered, they were spat on, they were screamed at. So can you just imagine having that kind of a barrier? Coupled with you trying to pursue your education, you have to deal with some of the remnants of folks wanting it to remain segregated. So that's some of the history. So despite over 65 years since we've had the whole dismantling of separate but equal, we know that there is still some segregation, that some impacts of segregation that take place in school settings, even if it's done indirectly. I'm from the South, and I can tell you some schools in the South still have openly segregated proms, openly segregated events at the schools. Usually the students are not in favor of it, but nonetheless in 2020, that's still a thing. So next I'm going to talk about the school to prison pipeline. If you're unfamiliar with the school to prison pipeline, eventually it's a funnel where African American boys are identified at an alarming rate and they are expelled or put out of school. So usually it begins as behavioral issues, and hence the school to prison pipeline begins. So the idea is there's a study or some stats that say you have about 18% of preschoolers who are Black, but about 50% of preschoolers who are expelled are Black children, more specifically Black males. So hence that's how the school to prison pipeline begins. So there's some history to the school resource officers as well. If you're familiar with when resource officers began to be placed in school, you may see the correlation there as well to the whole school to prison pipeline phenomenon. Another area of education that we should put some focus on is the entire idea of an achievement gap. So many schools are giving letter grades, but the achievement gap says the gap of achievement from white students to minority students, namely Black students, is usually a wider gap. So you might have a school with a seemingly good letter grade of an A, but that may be an A performance for white are majority students, but not your minority students. So at that school, you might have an A grade, but the Black students may be performing at a C or a D level. So achievement gap is something that there's many causes and correlations to what causes the achievement gap. It may be school funding. It may be the who's actually doing the educating at the school, and it also may be the resources. So there's a lot of interesting studies and documentaries out there on the school to prison pipeline and achievement gaps. But I would encourage you to, if that's something of interest, to look a little bit deeper at that. And then also we have to remember that there are different access experiences that students experience. If you're familiar with Michelle Obama and her Becoming series, so her Becoming book tour, the Netflix documentary, she tells a story about a high school guidance counselor that told her when she expressed an interest in attending Princeton for college that she was in Princeton material. Now, her older brother was already a Princeton student, so she knew that she could be Princeton material. But I often think about, what about those students who someone telling you that you're not college material is enough to keep them set back. I can tell you in my personal life, I remember having someone, when I expressed that I was leaving to go to college, I had someone in my hometown tell me, why are you leaving? Why are you wasting your time? Everyone else who has left from this area to go to college, they usually come back. And I remember boldly saying to her, that won't be my story. I won't be back. But I often think about how many people who I know may have had aspirations to go to college, but the people speaking into their lives weren't speaking positively or words of affirmation or words of encouragement. So access is one of the things. Also, when we think about curriculums, you have to think about, again, who's teaching the classes, what's being taught, but also the idea of honors classes and advanced placement classes. Typically, the research shows that those classes are a form of segregation in themselves. If you have a school that may be, say, there's a high percentage of minority students, the studies show that the AP and honors classes are overwhelmingly populated with majority white students, and then the traditional classes will have your minority students. So in a sense, you can have what I might call modern day segregation. So honors classes are known to have barriers for minority students. AP classes are the lack of access to them, the college preparatory classes, and then also exit exams, high school exit exams. So those are areas that oftentimes become barriers for people in education as well. Next, I'm going to talk about standardized testing. So standardized testing is an area that I've always been fascinated in, especially inequities and barriers that exist and persist in standardized testing. So I'm not just talking about your ACT, SAT, LSAT, MCAT, but I'm also talking about IQ testing. So the tests we know, the standardized testing, they were on a rise around the 1950s and 60s. And I would caution you that we have to even take a deeper look at who created these tests, who created the standardized testing, what was their philosophy, what were their beliefs. We know that many of the creators of these standardized tests were eugenicists in their own right. So that's one of the things. Also, stats show that students of color and minorities typically do not fare well on standardized testing, but I would say that there's reasons to why that's the case. So for example, many believe that those exams were designed in their nature to weed out certain populations. I know around the rise of standardized testing, many Ivy League schools begin to say things like, we're going to use these tests to point out the brainy kids, but there's biases that are typically known to be embedded in the exams. I'll use an example from a Good Times show. If you don't know Good Times, it's a 1970s show that was based in Chicago, and the family lived in the public housing area of Chicago. Well, in a nutshell, they have their youngest son, Michael, who they know is a smart kid, and they believe that he's going to go on to college. Michael comes home one day and tells his mom that he refused to continue taking an IQ test because the test was racist. The mother inquired how, and he gave her an example of a question. He said, well, there was a question that wanted you to say things that are comparable. So he said, so the example was cup is to what? And there were four options. So you have cup is to table, cup is to saucer, cup is to wall, or cup is to chair. So Michael said, my good friend so-and-so got that question wrong because he said cup is to table, because in his home there are no saucers. This child culturally does not know what a saucer is. Now they tried to give us a little bit of comic relief on the show because the father James interjects and he says, well, in my day it would have been cup is to floor because we didn't even have a table. Well, the studio audience laughs, but we miss the message, the bigger picture, that there are these natural inherent biases that are embedded into the very nature of the standardized testing. And it may be things that culturally, if you're not aware of certain things, might cause you to get questions wrong. So, one other thing that I have to point out about the standardized testing is the high rise of preparatory courses. So we know that for tests like ACT and SATs, the prep courses, and even the LSAT, I'm a lawyer by trade and I took the LSAT, and I can tell you the prep courses are really expensive. So you get students who you have to have access to resources to be able to pay for standardized testing, prep courses. So if I'm from a certain demographic area, my parents may not have disposable income sitting around of an extra $2,000 to pay for my prep course. So I often say that these tests are not just a test of knowledge, but a test of wealth, because this testing, usually the prep courses teaches you how to take the test. So I argue that the ACT and SAT sometimes are not a test of knowledge, but a test of wealth and access to those preparatory courses. My premise has always been that if the test is designed really to be an aptitude test, then we should disband and have it where it's illegal for you to be able to have a preparatory course. Some will say, now, why is that a big deal? We know that the better ACT or SAT score you receive, the better chance you have to get into certain universities. The better universities you get into, in turn, is then the better job you can get. The better job you can get is then the better quality of life that you can have and the better amount of money that you're able to make. Now, I'm not suggesting that a college education is a requirement to have a good life, but that's essentially the way the system is set up. Also, we can say the ACT and SAT score determines what kind of scholarships or funding you may get to a university. We already know that the research shows that there's a debt crisis for minority students. Black graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed post-graduation. That's a whole nother story. I'll do another video on biases in employment, and we'll talk about some of the barriers that Black and minority students face, such as discrimination based on purely your name and the way it appears on a resume, and the suggestive nature that you are a minority. So these are only some of the topics. As you can see, it goes deep, right? There's overall funding and resource issues that persist. We know some schools don't have the same access to resources, textbooks, and alike. We do know that inequalities persist. And then it's not even to mention, if you can get past the ACT and SAT, we know a lot of students say that when they get to the high stress area of college, they oftentimes don't feel a sense of belonging as minority students. Not only do you have to adjust to a new environment, you often have to do so with the pressures of being a minority. I'll say one other stat. There's a stat that says if you have a minority student that has a minority teacher in the K through 12 setting, they're more likely to go to college. And I do think that that makes a difference. I always talk about my higher education and also my K through 12 experience. I often talk about one of my favorite teachers. Her name was Stephanie Williams. She was my 5th grade teacher. She was an African American woman, and she was always professional and poised. I've since then looked for her and can't find her. It seems like no one knows her whereabouts, but she's someone who I just want to reach back to say thank you. Thank you for being a positive role model and instilling in me that education was something that could be a way out. I also want to say, as a first generation college student, I do believe that education has brought value to my life. With my undergraduate degree, I believe that I grew a lot in that setting, and I also believe that education is a key. But it will be even better if we can remove the barriers that are in place that prevent students from continuing to excel. So those are just some of the topics that come up with education. And I can tell you, I'm going to continue to dig deeper into other systematic ways that people are oppressed in academic settings, and as well as in other institutions that we enter on an everyday basis, whether it be school, whether it be hospitals, or just your job in general. In talking about education and the current events, I'd be remiss if I don't talk about the inequities that are rearing themselves in the educational setting as a result of the global pandemic. We know that since the month of March, many schools shut down and families were forced to enter the virtual learning space. Now, that has indirectly impacted many students because the idea is the presumption of going virtual is that all homes have access to high quality Wi Fi and as well as computers. So, but what about those homes that don't don't have computers or access to technology? Or what about those homes that might have a computer or Wi-Fi, but there are 3 or 4 kids in the home having to share that one device? So I would encourage you to continue to think about that as a possible inequity as we enter this fall season and many schools are still going to be in that virtual learning space. Think about those parents who are trying to balance home and academics, and think about those students who are having to be virtually educated by parents who may not have all of the resources present. When we talk about achievement gaps and access to education, by the very nature of this pandemic, I know it's out of our control, but the very nature of this pandemic may cause additional barriers and biases for students, some of whom are in these formative years of their, say, K-5 education. So I will continue to do these videos. If there are any topics that you would like to see me cover, please let me know. But until then, I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you are made aware of when I post additional videos. I also ask that you like and share this video. Until then, I encourage you to keep being bold. Have a great day.